This episode of All About the Gear is brought to you by BorrowLenses.com.
All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of All About the Gear, featuring my good friend Doug K and myself co-hosting this thing. Today we're going to be talking about an entry-level DSLR, the Nikon, is it D3300, the Nikon D3300. And specifically, I know Doug's going to go through the specs and all that, but one of the directions that I wanted to take this whole discussion is in the, are we, people like Doug and I are I don't know, maybe me more so than Doug, kind of have become really advocates of smaller cameras and mirrorless and that kind of thing. This thing hits the scene. It's relatively cheap. I want to get into Doug's brain about, am I a mirrorless fanboy, and is that fanboyism warranted if in fact I am a fanboy? So Doug, the Nikon D3300, 3300, who's this for, first of all? Who's this for?
This is definitely an entry-level DSLR. It's Nikon's lightest weight, pretty much lowest price DSLR. And here on All About the Gear, we spend so much time with relatively high-end cameras.
Yeah.
A lot of them that cost over $1,000. So I thought it would be good to take a look at the entry-level cameras and see what they're like. Because to be honest, I had no idea until I got a hold of this what the entry-level cameras were like. This guy is $650 with a pretty good kit lens. 18 to 55 millimeter seems to be the norm now for APS-C size bodies, and $580 without. But it's definitely an entry-level camera.
So when we say entry-level, I know we're going to dive into the specs here, but clearly it has an F-mount on it, right? So you'll be able to, as you grow your lens collection and you decide to upgrade from this camera, your lenses will grow with you or go with you, right? So when you say entry level, what are we giving up? Is it sensitivity on the sensor? Is it battery life? Is it frames per second? What's the metric that pushes this down into entry level?
Well, it's all about, it's all of the above, I guess you'd say. It's interesting how manufacturers make and differentiate their entry-level cameras from their high-end cameras. There are some things that really do cost them money. The high-quality sensors are expensive. A lot of the things in the camera cost real money. But then there are things like bracketing, which is just a software feature. Yeah. And this camera has no bracketing, for example.
Sure.
And so it's clear that they keep features out of the mix in order to differentiate this from the higher-end cameras. So I'd say it's really, compared to a high-end DSLR, first of all, it's the crop sensor versus a full sensor. It's got a fairly minimal autofocus system. It's actually pretty good for video, which surprised me. It has no Wi-Fi. It has no touch screen. It doesn't have a tilt screen. So it's, it's sort of the bare bones of everything.
Yeah, when the software pieces of what you just said, so specifically the auto bracketing, on the one hand, I'm okay with not having auto bracketing in a camera because I know how to bracket myself, right? It's okay that it's not there. It's not like I'm losing anything. But what kind of rubs me the wrong way a little bit is when I know that the hardware that I spend all my money on can do a thing, but the manufacturer commented out that part of the code so that I can't do it, so that I'll buy the next one. I understand it. I understand differentiating product lines by feature set, but when it's just software, I don't know. It gets under my skin a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was saying. Essentially now, they don't have a button for bracketing, so one could say, well, they don't have a button, so there was no reason to have the code. But yeah. It's not even there in the menus.
Okay.
I think.
So write it down. So the basics. So dive in.
Yeah, so this replaces the D3200, which has been out for maybe a year or so. Mm-hmm. It's got a 24 megapixel sensor, which, to be honest, I think is a little bit too many megapixels for an entry-level camera, especially because that means the noise is going to be more of a problem. Mm-hmm. They've taken out the low-pass filter. Whoa, what a trendy thing these days. Everybody's leaving out the anti-aliasing low-pass filters, and to see that in a low-end camera is sort of interesting. It tells us that they think that they can solve this problem in their CPUs now. They can take care of that.
Well, didn't you have you bought a D800E that was minus the anti-aliasing filter, right? And then you returned it. But what?
No, I still have it.
Oh, you still have it? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I had a lot of troubles with the autofocus system, but I still have the camera.
Okay. And
Yeah.
do you notice a marked difference between images that you take with cameras that have the anti-aliasing filter versus the D800E?
No. No.
I love it. I was waiting on, yes, the contrast and saturation and, all this is different, but no.
I compared a D800 to a D800E very carefully, and could I, with the best lens I own, see a difference? Yeah, I could find it, but with regular photography, I couldn't see the difference.
Interesting. I know you're going to get some comments on this because the pixel peepers out there are going to say, Doug K, you need to change your glasses because without the aliasing filter, you could see this chromatic aberration and blah, blah, blah. You know what's going to happen.
Yeah. And just, in real world shooting, I didn't see that difference. I mean, the D800 and the D800E are remarkable cameras. And, if you don't, in either case, if you don't use a rock solid tripod, I never use that camera without a tripod. There's no point.
Yeah.
Anyway, so anyway, that's the trendy thing. So from the D3200, they've got a slightly faster shutter, 5 frames a second versus 4 frames a second. You can get it in red, which is cool. Actually, you can get it in black, red, or gray. The gray is new, but I love this camera in red. I didn't get to test one, but
I would probably get one in red if I was in the market for one.
Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
So the big things about it are sort of what's missing. Like I say, the fact that it's compared to the mirrorless guys that we're used to, it doesn't have the tilt screen, it doesn't have the touch screen, no Wi-Fi, no apps, nothing like that. What's that?
No Wi-Fi. You tried to gloss over that. See?
Yeah.
How are you going to make a camera without Wi-Fi these days?
You can get it externally. You can buy a Wi-Fi thingy and plug it into it, and you'll get Wi-Fi that way. But it's Wi-Fi is pretty common now, and even in entry-level cameras. I think your Sony NEX5 has it, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. The NEX5R sitting on the shelf somewhere around here has built-in Wi-Fi.
Right.
And it works surprisingly well.
Yeah, and that's a fairly low-end camera.
Yep.
So those are the big. I think my biggest disappointment with the camera was probably in the autofocus system. It has only 11 autofocus points, and I just found that when I wanted it to, for example, when I let the camera pick the autofocus point, they're so far apart that the chance of hitting what I want is fairly slim.
Yeah.
So you just need more autofocus points, period. Now, if you select the point yourself, or if you shoot like I do, which is you use only the center point and you recompose after focusing, that's fine. But the typical user for an entry-level camera isn't going to do that. The typical user is going to throw this into full auto mode.
And let it figure out what the subject is and focus on that.
Yeah, and I think, I'd like to see a little more autofocus points. Now, again, that's a good point, that someone using this is probably early in their photographic experience. Mm-hmm. They're going to throw it into auto mode. It has a really interesting feature called guide. I don't know which other Nikon cameras have this now, but if you turn it to guide mode, which is separate from auto or aperture priority or anything like that, guide mode sort of walks you through menus of what do you want to do. Like, oh, I want to take a picture that's backlit, and here's what you do. The concept is pretty cool for a beginning photographer, mm-hmm. but they don't follow through with it. It sort of takes you to a certain point, and then it sort of leaves you. And I wish that they would flesh it out and tell me a little bit more so I could actually learn something from it. But it's an interesting concept to use that LCD on the back as a training feature.
You want to be guided a little bit further.
That's right. Before they let you. Good concept, weak execution.
Yeah, which is kiss of death. So the big thing about these cameras is quality, right? So looking at the different quality levels at different ISOs and all that. In your experience, taking this out, putting it through its paces, what's the range where you can get usable images? I
thought it did fine until you got beyond ISO 1600. Mm-hmm. I think the noise gets to be pretty bad above that level. And now again, for the average shooter who's shooting outdoors in the daytime or using a flash, that 1600 is probably just fine. I happen to be a no flash, high ISO guy, so I'm putting it up there at 6400 or something and seeing just a lot of junk in there.
Yeah. Is it the noise in there? You're not able to negate that with Lightroom's noise reduction?
Nah, it gets pretty ugly because this is real, color confetti noise.
Got it.
It's not the kind that it's not pretty noise that turns into nice film grain look kind of stuff, you know.
Sure, sure. Well, then the other piece of this is just when you're creating these images, the big part for photographers is actually seeing the image, like looking through the viewfinder, the LCD. So how does all that work? Does it have an electronic viewfinder? Is it an optical viewfinder? How does that work?
It's an optical viewfinder because it's an SLR. It's got about 95% coverage, which is sort of typical for cameras like this. I've never really understood why they can't all be 100% when they're optical, but they aren't, except the real high-end cameras.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very bright. It's not great, but again, it's what you'd expect at this price level, I think. The LCD, on the other hand, is real bright. Very nicely done LCD. So if you want to work off the back of the camera in live view mode, I think you'd be very happy with it.
Yeah. So okay, so it's bright enough, but again, it's not touchscreen on the back, right?
No touchscreen, but it's the standard Nikon menu structure. Although when you bring it up by default, it's got these really sort of interesting. It looks like dials on the back. It's sort of a funny way. It also has Nikon's equivalent of a quick menu that we've learned to love from our mirrorless cameras, which is push one button and get to this sort of display of the most commonly used options, but you don't get to use your finger to select them. You've got to use the control wheels to select ISO or white balance or whatever it is.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the lack of Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi and having a touchscreen, those are two things that I've become really reliant on in my camera. So, it's a stretch because I have cameras that don't have that. Like we were just talking earlier about the Sony was a RX100 Mark II. So I was playing around with that one and no touchscreen, right? So I found myself hitting the back of the screen trying to hit things. I'm like, why can't I not hit this screen? I'm used to it. And then I'll go to my iPhone. Of course, I can touch everything. On this thing that costs at least as much, I can't touch anything.
Yeah.
So.
For me, the big one is a tiltable LCD.
Yeah.
That to me is even more. I don't use the Wi-Fi very much, if at all. But my number one requirement is a tiltable LCD. After that, it would be touchscreen, and for me, number 3 would be Wi-Fi. So we're in the same ballpark, so slightly different priorities, I think.
Gotcha. Such is life. That's the way life is. What about shutter speeds on this thing? That used to be the metric, right? Back in the day when we were playing with these SLRs, the max shutter speed used to be one of the levers that marketers could pull to get you to buy this thing. Like I remember seeing the hummingbirds on the Nikon brochure, like it could just 1/8,000th of a second freeze the wings of a hummingbird. Right. I never found a hummingbird to shoot, but it was awesome to know that I could if I wanted to.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this goes to 1/4000th of a second, which I think is fine because you're not using very fast lenses with this camera. You're not using high ISOs. So the fact is that 1/4000th of a second with the lenses you're going to use on this camera and the conditions under which you're going to shoot is going to be fine.
Okay.
I think 1/8000th of a second is pretty much the state of the art in mechanical shutters now, and we're only one stop away from that.
Yeah. Do you know how fast? What's the sync speed? The flash sync speed of this guy?
I don't know. I didn't check that out.
Okay, we can put that in the notes.
Good question. We'll find out.
Yeah. What about frames per second? And so for the folks that are like, hey, I'm going to get this thing. I'm going to go shoot sports at 1/4000th of a second. How many frames per second can it shoot?
Yeah, it'll shoot up to 5 frames a second. What's interesting, though, is that when you do that, it's only going to autofocus on the first frame. It will not change focus on the successive frame. So if you're shooting a runner coming at you in continuous mode, you're not going to be able to run this at 5 frames a second. It will set the exposure for each frame independently, but it will not refocus in between like the higher end cameras will do.
So that makes me want to say, what you talking about, Willis? Because that's not. I mean, it's gonna, especially if you're shooting sports. You got the football player coming at you. It tracks him or locks on him, takes a picture. Exposure's great. He keeps running. You keep shooting. Now every successive frame after that is out of focus, but exposed perfectly.
That's right. Hey, it's a look, it's a style.
Well, maybe they're trying to get you to do the focus stacking or something.
Or be sure he's running directly perpendicular to your view, so that he stays at the same distance.
Yeah, stay at the 50-yard line and don't go too far. What about controls? So getting around this, like we were saying before, when you get one of these cameras in your hand, you kind of need to be able to, something like a sports car, right? You got to know where the gear shift is, and all the things have to be in the right spot so that you can concentrate on getting the images. How does this camera fare when it comes to just overall feel of the controls of it?
Yeah, it's sort of what you'd expect for an entry-level camera. Minimal. You've got your PASM dial, for program, aperture priority, shutter priority, manual. It has a dedicated exposure compensation button on the top. And the interesting thing about a dedicated exposure compensation button is, does an entry-level person understand exposure compensation? And I question that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was glad to have it there. I used it when I was in aperture priority, for example. But I had to say, gee, I know a number of times I've had students who have been shooting for quite a while, and exposure compensation is something you're not familiar with. So
why don't you explain that, just for the people that are like, well, I don't know what exposure compensation is. So if you've got, typically on a camera, you've got 3 controls to vary the amount of light reaching the sensor, right? So you've got the ISO, or sensitivity, you've got aperture, or the hole that the light's coming through, and you got shutter speed, the duration that the shutter stays open to allow the amount of light in. Each does something differently on the resulting image. For example, fast shutter speeds will allow you to stop motion or blur motion. The wider or smaller apertures allow you to vary the bokeh, or the blur of the background, and what's in focus and what's not in focus. And of course, ISO is the sensitivity of everything and affects the other two. Where does exposure compensation fit into that mix?
Okay, so if you're in any mode in which the camera selects one of those, for example, let's say you select the shutter speed, you select the aperture, but you're in auto ISO, or you're in aperture priority where the camera selects the shutter speed, or you're in shutter priority where the camera selects the aperture, then the camera is going to have to decide one or more of those parameters. And it's going to make its decision based on what it sees through the lens.
Yep.
If you don't like that, if you want the image to be overall brighter or darker than what the camera selects, that's when you use exposure compensation. You can say, I want this to be a third of a stop, 1 stop, 2 stops, even 3 stops lighter or darker than what the camera wants to do. Now, in full manual mode, where you specify all 3 of these, the exposure compensation dial does absolutely nothing because the camera is not making any of the decisions whatsoever.
Right.
The fact is, I think most people using this camera, if they're taking a backlit scene, are going to dial that in through the menu system, or using the dial on top, which has all the scene modes, for example. A portrait mode, a mountain scene mode, a landscape, for example. And you're going to pick more of an automated way of doing this. But again, for those people who understand it, exposure compensation is a great feature. It's a little odd that it's the one thing that's so easy to get to when so many other things aren't.
Right. Got it. It's good. Good. Demystification of exposure compensation by Doug K. Awesome. So Doug, here's the other piece. So I'm just on the heels of NAB, so I have video on the brain, right? So looking at this camera, what is it? Is it a camera that people can seriously consider using to do YouTube or short films and that sort of thing? In other words, is the video decent out of this thing?
I thought the video was pretty good. I guess that's more what the market is for this camera, assuming that people who want an entry-level DSLR might be using them for family and friends kinds of pictures. The video was pretty good. It's 1080p. It'll go into the slow motion modes, 50 or 60 frames a second. It has a built-in mono mic, but it has, drum roll please, just for you, Frederick, it has external mic jack, so you can you can plug in stereo mic if you want to. Autofocus is again a challenge, just because it's not that many autofocus points. Well, actually, let me back up. It's not using the autofocus points in video. It's using the live view contrast autofocus. It was pretty good. It was pretty good, and I thought, given where it was positioned, it was a decent entry-level camera that had video.
Nice. Okay, so video, thumbs up on the video side of things.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's jump to competition for this and take a look at, or I want to hear your perspective. You've tried a lot of cameras. You probably own a ton of cameras by this point. Where does this one fit into the lineup? If a photographer's like, yeah, I'm going with Nikon, that's awesome, or I'm not going with Nikon. I'm looking at even the competitive bodies in that range from different manufacturers. Where does the D3300 stick in?
Good question here. I think if I wanted a Nikon DSLR, I would sure wish that I could scrape together another $250 and get the D5300.
Mm-hmm.
It's got for that few extra dollars, $250 extra. It has quite a bit better optical viewfinder. It does have an articulating LCD, which means a lot to me.
Mm-hmm.
A much better autofocus system and built-in Wi-Fi and GPS in the camera. So I think that's a great upgrade to go to the D5300. Now, again, that's if you particularly want to go into Nikon. And I gotta believe the only people buying this camera are those that either aren't going to go any farther at all, or for some reason, maybe it's because it's what their grandfather had, that they want to go into Nikon cameras, that it's a brand thing. It's my guess.
Right.
If you're not stuck in the world of Nikon for some reason, you probably want to take a look at the Canon EOS Rebel Sl1. Now, this isn't a camera I've tried myself, but our good friend Gordon Lang over at CameraLabs.com suggests this as a possible competitor. The Rebel Sl1 is the same price with a kit lens, $650 or so. Smaller, lighter, touch-sensitive LCD, a better viewfinder. It's got bracketing, better autofocus, all sorts of things. Not quite as good maybe in the video department because it doesn't do 50 or 60 frames a second, but it's a slightly older camera, so you can get the street price down to, like I say, $650. It's actually about a $750 camera marked down $100. So if this is really what you want, which is an entry-level DSLR at this price level, then take a look at that Rebel. But
before you continue, I know you're going to go and talk some of the other guys. Is this a camera that someone that's an existing Nikon user wanted to buy as a backup camera and throw it in their bag? Would that make sense, or should they just pony up and buy a better, more feature-rich camera?
I guess it depends what they're backing up from. You know, if you're using a relatively high-end Nikon, then this is not much of a backup. You've got to get up there at least to the 5300 or the D7100 level. You know, now if you're at the D7100 level, maybe a 5300 is a good second camera, but it's hard to imagine that this is a good second camera for anyone. You know who this is good for? If your spouse or significant other wants to have a camera to take with you on a trip, if you already know the Nikon menu system, if you've already got a couple of Nikon lenses, then this is a great camera for sort of a second shooter, if you will, a social second shooter.
Got it.
And I think that's sort of an interesting application because there are people who will travel with a couple of Nikon lenses, and to be able to have, you know, somebody else on the trip with compatible gear is sort of handy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so continue. Who else is in this competitive landscape for this guy?
Well, now we're going to the meat of this, which is why would you buy an SLR to begin with?
Yes. This is what I teased at the beginning of the show, right? So just to reiterate that, me personally, I have DSLRs here, and I have mirrorless cameras here. I find myself using my mirrorless cameras far more than the DSLRs. I can count on one hand how many times I've taken the DSLR out on a shoot versus the mirrorless, which goes with me all the time because it's lighter and more convenient. And so where my brain is, and we were talking about this off air a little bit, my brain is, am I just becoming a mirrorless fanboy because I like the format of mirrorless and these smaller cameras and all that goes with them so much, or is there something on the DSLR side that I'm missing because I'm so blinded by all the cool stuff on the mirrorless side? So I was hoping you could answer that for me. This is my counseling session, Father Doug.
Well, this is a subject we have talked about since the beginning of All About the Gear. We're coming up on our 1-year anniversary, by the way.
Wow.
And it's something we'll continue to talk about because almost all the advances are being made in the mirrorless cameras. I'm like you, I just got back from a week in Cuba. I only took a mirrorless camera. I was in Turkey for 3 weeks. I only took a mirrorless camera. When I go out the door, I rarely have one of my SLRs with me. But there are times when I need that. For example, I went to Maui to shoot humpback whales. And I needed, in this case, I took a Nikon D3S, which is a real high-speed camera in terms of shutter frames per second, in terms of autofocus, in terms of longer lenses, autofocusing lenses. This was the right camera to have.
Got it.
In terms of accessories, let's say you want a sophisticated strobe system like Nikon or Canon have in their arsenal. Let's say you want specialized lenses like tilt shift lenses. Generally, you're going to find so much more in these legacy systems because they've been around for decades. I think a serious photographer these days, a professional photographer for sure, probably has to have a DSLR for those 5 or 10% of the situations where they need something they just can't get out of the mirrorless, which could be, again, specialty accessories, or it could be fast shutter speeds, really fast autofocus, and so forth. But for that 90 to 95% of the things that even pros do, mirrorless cameras are there today. And a year from now, I'm not sure we'll see any advantage in the DSLRs.
Interesting. Well, we'll be here a year from now. We'll take a look at that. So then, who else is in that lineup that this D3300 would be going against on the mirrorless side? So if someone had, a spare $700 or so, and they're trying to figure out which camera to get to put a fine point on it, should they get this D3300 or one of the mirrorless competing cameras?
Yeah, if I were going entry level today, and I had no reason to go Nikon in particular, if the brand wasn't important to me, I would look primarily at Sony and Panasonic Lumix, I think. The Sony, you can save money. You can go down to spend $500 street price and get the Sony Alpha 5000, the A5000, which is the successor to the NEX5 that I know you own.
Yep.
Great camera. It's got a tilt LCD. It's got just a lot of great features, and it's only $500. Marvelous entry-level camera.
Yep.
The little teeny Lumix GM1.
Oh yeah, one of my favorite cameras. Let me grab mine.
Yeah, you can get both of them. They're both sitting around there somewhere. I hear voices.
Look at that. Here it is. It's in my bag right now.
Yeah.
This is my little Lumix GM1.
It's a teeny little thing. It takes terrific pictures.
Yep. Look at that. No, I would argue, Doug, that I take terrific pictures. The camera helps me with that.
Is that right? I always thought it was your gear.
It's not all about the gear, Doug. Come on.
Yeah, that's right. But that camera has great autofocus. It's got built-in Wi-Fi.
Oh yeah.
Maybe not the best for video. Whatever you tell me. You've got more experience with it.
It's awesome. I mean, it's got the same sensor in it that the GX7 has in it. I mean, the same thing. And I did a video about this Paris trip that I'm doing in a couple of weeks here, and I shot the whole thing with this little camera, the whole thing, and edited, put it up online. Go to my YouTube channel if you want to check it out. But it's a Frederick Goes to Paris video. It was shot entirely with this little camera. It just blows me away.
Well, it's good because you're the guy who's got all my alternatives here. You've got the NEX5, you've got the Lumix GX1, and you also have the Sony RX100 version 2, which is, now we're talking about, just a point-and-shoot camera, which actually costs more than this D3300, but it's probably a better camera.
Yeah, but it's not an interchangeable lens camera, obviously. So it has a built-in fixed lens, which is a crazy, insanely cool lens. It's a 1.8. But it's if you're looking for an interchangeable or proper DSLR or mirrorless type camera, the GM1 has interchangeable lenses. Look at that. Yeah. So I can put all my micro four thirds lenses on this guy.
It does, but that little RX100 Mark II has the same zoom range as this D3300. It's tiny by comparison, and if you can get past the ego aspect of having a large camera, And if you don't need a viewfinder, things like the RX100 are marvelous cameras.
It is. It's an amazing camera. It's small, gets out of the way. You run, battery lasts forever. Video, but again, no touchscreen, no video input or audio input. So, yeah.
So
one day.
Yeah, this is going to be coming up in almost every show we talk about. But the move is definitely towards mirrorless. Nikon and Canon in particular are slow to go in that direction because it's obviously going to cannibalize their existing brand.
Mm-hmm.
And all the action is happening in Olympus, Panasonic, Fuji, and Sony. I mean, that's where all the cool new stuff is. So it was great to be able to check out this new camera. I'd like to play with the 5300 someday. Maybe check out that Canon Rebel Sl1. But I gotta say, unless you're for some reason committed to the Nikon brand and a DSLR, I'm not sure this is the right camera.
All right, cool. That was a very nice way of saying Doug doesn't like the camera and don't buy it. Doug's like, you said it, I didn't say it. It was you.
It's not in my bag. What can I say?
Yeah, no, I hear you. All right, so what's coming up next? What are some of the cameras you have floating around there?
Great stuff. We're going back to the middle and high end, if you will. The next camera up's probably going to be the Fuji Xt One. We did the Xe1, we skipped the Xe2, and the Xt1 is a marvelous camera with probably the best controls and usability of anything out there. I love it. That's coming up soon.
I follow Zach Arias online, obviously, and I know he's got 2 feet in that Fuji camp, and I see nothing but amazing images coming out of him. So that thing, of course, it's not all the cameras, photographer, but if that camera performs half as well in any other mortal's hands, it's a pretty cool camera.
Yeah, and that's something I want to throw in here. I just read a commentary. I can't remember who wrote this. I'm sorry for not giving them credit for this, but whoever wrote this said a very good point, which is we are at the point with mirrorless cameras where any one of the high-end mirrorless cameras can make awesome images.
Mm-hmm.
It could be Olympus, Panasonic, Fuji, or Sony. As long as you're near the top end of those camera lines, they are as good as anything else.
Yeah.
We're only talking now about ergonomic features, and controls, add-ons like Wi-Fi, GPS, touchscreen, tilt screen, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
That's what we're talking about because we're past the point where quality is an issue.
Yeah, that, and then I would also layer on top of that today's crappy cameras are better than yesterday's top-end cameras, and yesterday's top-end cameras and their associated photographers did some outstanding work.
Yeah.
So don't let the camera not having the top end of the range stop you from shooting and realizing your vision, because I'm sure Ansel Adams back in the day, wasn't saying, man, if I just had that next viewfinder camera, I could get a great shot of El Capitan in Yosemite. So
yeah, I mean all of my cameras are better than what we had, and for some reason my pictures just don't look as good as his. I can't figure out why. So anyway. Coming up right after that, we want to do the Nikon D4S night vision camera, 400,000 plus ISO.
Insane.
And then, are you listening to us, Sony? Hello out there. Send us a Sony Alpha 7S, which is, again, over 400,000 ISO. I really want to play with those things.
Doug, just on that real quick before we close this off, how to frame this? When would you find yourself in need of 400,600 ISO?
Never probably at that level, but imagine how good these cameras look at, 64,000 or something like that. And what does that allow me to do? That allows me to shoot at high shutter speeds, at relatively tight apertures. I don't have to worry about getting really fast glass. It gives me incredible flexibility in what I shoot. Even for a street shooter, you can go out. There are a lot of times when I shoot street photography where I really want 1,000th of a second in relatively low light, and that high ISO is going to give it to me.
Got it. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing your test. I want to see how Doug K puts a camera with that high 400,600 ISO to the test. Are you going to lock yourself in the basement with a candle and see if you can create portraits? Is that what you're...
Who needs a candle?
Exactly. Yeah, who needs a candle? It'll just
No.
be ambient light,
No, we're going to be able to capture images with the cosmic glow of the universe. I think is all we need. We'll shoot in starlight and see how it goes.
The leftover radiation from the universe is all you need as a light source these days. Awesome. Well, Doug, this has been another informative All About the Gear on the Nikon D3300. I think we should close it off here. What do you say?
I think absolutely. Thank you so much, Frederick.
All right, man. See you next time.
Okay, bye-bye.